She parked on my land. Not a misunderstanding. Not a little over the line. A full-size, gleaming Bentley hunched like a brass monument right across my gravel driveway and deep into the field where my corn was just beginning to peek above the soil. The car belonged to Karen. Karen, the HOA president. Karen, who smiled in neighborhood meetings like she'd invented civilization. I stood there with my coffee, watching the engine tick and the driver's door stay closed, as if that car had every right to be there. The truth is, she didn't. This was the first moment I realized polite requests might not be enough, and I remember thinking then that this small moment would decide whether words or action would carry the day. My farm is stubborn and honest. 4 acres might not sound like much to a developer or someone flipping houses in the city, but to me, it's a kingdom, a living museum, and a stubborn old friend all rolled into one. This land doesn't just sit there quietly under the sun. It breathes with me, changes with me, and sometimes even argues with me. And like any stubborn friend, it never lets me forget who I am or where I came from. The barn sits right in the middle of it all, patched with wood my grandfather cut by hand more than 60 years ago. Every board has a story. One plank came from a storm-fallen oak that nearly crushed the old well. Another was scavenged from a mill that closed before I was born. My grandfather's hands are in every nail, and his spirit seems to linger in the smell of old hay and machine grease that refuses to fade no matter how many seasons pass. When I step inside, I don't just see tools and hay bales. I see him, bent over with his hammer, squinting in the light, reminding me that things worth having are worth fixing. The driveway tells its own story too. It remembers every truck that's ever rattled down its length, from my father's first pickup with a dented fender to the delivery vans that bring my seed orders every spring. When I drive down it at dawn, gravel crunching under the tires, I feel like I'm part of something bigger, another chapter in a book that started long before I was born. I've raised goats on this land, mischievous little escape artists who can find a weak spot in a fence faster than you can blink. I still laugh, remembering the time 3 of them broke loose and wandered into the neighbor's rose garden, chewing with such determination you'd think roses were planted just for them. I've raised chickens too, squawking, clucking, busy little workers who taught me patience as I chased them back into their coop every evening. The compost pile sits in the corner of the yard, humming like a quiet engine in the heat of summer. To anyone else, it might just look like a heap of rotting scraps, but to me it's proof that nothing here goes to waste. Every eggshell, every apple core, every stalk of corn that gave all it could, it all breaks down and comes back as black gold, feeding next season's crop. That pile is alive, and in its silent, steady way, it reminds me that life is a cycle we're all part of. Most mornings, I wake up earlier than I'd like, but later than the sun deserves. There's always a moment where I step onto the porch, mug of coffee in hand, and whisper a sheepish apology to the horizon. Sorry I wasn't up before you. The sun forgives me, of course. It always does. And as the first light spills across the fields, touching the barn roof and the dew-soaked grass, I feel forgiven too. This land carries my family's name. My grandfather worked it. My father bled for it. And now it's mine to keep alive. It's not just soil and grass. It's promises stacked on promises. 1,000 small vows made to the people who came before me and the ones who'll come after. Promises in the fences I mend every spring. Promises in the seed packets I tuck carefully into rows of dirt. Promises in the mornings when I bend down to study raccoon prints in the mud and wonder how close they came to stealing my sweet corn again. The animals know me here. The soil knows me. The trees, with their bent branches and cicada humming bark, know me too. I belong to this place just as much as it belongs to me. But the neighborhood? That's newer, and it feels like a world apart. The people who moved and brought with them rules and meetings and an obsession with something they call curb appeal. They trim their hedges into perfect little squares, paint their mailboxes to match their shutters, and hold HOA meetings where they argue over which shade of beige is acceptable for siding. Beige. Meanwhile, I'm more worried about whether my goats will escape again or whether the well pump will hold through another dry summer. The HOA speaks the language of lawns and bylaws. I speak the language of dirt under fingernails and fences that sag under the weight of climbing vines. They worry about whether a yard ornament is too distracting. I worry about whether my tomatoes will survive the first frost. When the HOA board sends out emails about weed control or driveway pressure washing, I can't help but smile. My driveway has character. It carries the memory of every season, every storm, every boot that's trudged across it. Pressure washing it would be like scrubbing the wrinkles off my grandfather's face, erasing the history that makes it worth something in the first place. Sometimes, I sit on my porch and watch the contrast unfold. On one side, the neat little lawns where neighbors edge their grass with military precision, measuring with rulers to be sure every blade is the same length. On the other side, my wild patch of corn, my sunflower stalks leaning a little crooked, my compost pile steaming gently in the sun. My land is alive, messy, and stubborn, just like me. And yet, despite the differences, I try to coexist. I show up at their meetings, listen politely as they debate mailbox sizes, and nod when they remind me about community standards. But in my heart, I know, my land doesn't belong to their standards. It belongs to the rhythm of seasons, to the sweat on my back, to the memory of those who came before me. The funny thing is, they don't see it. They see 4 acres that look unkempt. They see fences patched with mismatched boards instead of brand new vinyl. They see grass growing a little higher than the regulation allows. They see a man who refuses to fit into their tidy box. But what I see is a home. A stubborn, honest home. I tend this place not because it wins points at HOA meetings, but because it keeps me grounded. Because when I step into that barn, I feel my grandfather's hand on my shoulder. Because when I walk the driveway, I hear the echo of my father's laughter in the gravel. Because when I plant seeds, I believe in tomorrow, even if tomorrow comes with weeds and work and sweat. And it's in those small, everyday promises that I find meaning. This land has taught me patience, resilience, and the kind of quiet pride that comes from knowing you've earned every inch you stand on. So when someone parks a shiny car on my soil like it's just another lot, when someone treats my home as if it's theirs to borrow, it cuts deeper than they realize. To them, it's just dirt. To me, it's everything. And that's why, on that morning when Karen parked her Bentley right across my driveway, I felt something shift. It wasn't about the car. It wasn't about inconvenience. It was about respect. Respect for the land. Respect for the work. Respect for the history that holds this place together. That moment became a test. A test of whether words would be enough, or whether action would have to speak louder. Because at the end of the day, this farm isn't just where I live. It's who I am. And when who you are gets stepped on, sometimes you have to decide. Will you bend, or will you stand? I knew my answer. I walked up to her window and tapped the glass. At first, it seemed like the kind of exchange neighbors have all the time. Quick words, quick apologies, and everyone moves on. But instead, the moment shifted. It grew heavier, stranger, as though the universe itself had slowed down just to see how this would unfold. She rolled the window down with a smooth, practiced calm. Not the fumbling, flustered motion of someone caught in the wrong place, but the casual grace of someone who believed she had every right to be there. Her sunglasses glinted in the sunlight, her nails immaculate on the steering wheel, and she didn't look the least bit embarrassed. "You can't park here," I said. My voice came out plain and firm. No anger, just fact, as plain as the gravel crunching under my boots. "This is my property." She smiled then, the kind of tight smile people wear when they want to seem polite, but don't mean a word of it. The corners of her mouth turned up, but her eyes stayed cold. "Oh, honey," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I'm just popping in to drop off a casserole for Mrs. Pritchard. I'll be 2 minutes." 2 minutes. That's what she said. But time has a funny way of proving people wrong. I stood there for a moment, watching her gather her purse and step out of the car. She didn't even bother locking it. The Bentley sat there gleaming, half on my gravel drive, half pressed into the edge of my field, its tires leaving faint impressions on the soil I tilled just weeks earlier. She walked off without another glance, her heels clicking against the road, as though the ground beneath her belonged to her as much as her manicured lawn did. 2 minutes passed. 5. 10. The sun moved higher, the sweat starting to bead on the back of my neck. By the time 15 minutes had gone by, I was pacing. 30 minutes later, I realized she wasn't just dropping off a casserole. She had vanished into someone else's house, like she owned the entire block, and her car remained planted in my driveway like a flag staked in conquered territory. Finally, I saw her again, not emerging with a casserole dish, not rushing to move her car as promised, but sashaying across the street toward a gathering of HOA board members. I recognized the scene instantly, the weekend brunch, a little social get-together where they drank sparkling water, traded gossip, and discussed which lawns violated bylaws. And there she was, slipping into the circle like a queen taking her throne. From my porch, I watched her lift a mimosa glass, laugh loudly at some offhand joke, and pivot seamlessly into a conversation about landscape regulations. It was as if she hadn't just parked illegally on someone's property and dismissed them with a lie. To her, it was nothing. To me, it was everything. At first, I decided not to let my frustration boil over. I told myself, maybe she forgot. Maybe she doesn't realize how important this land is to me. So I picked up the phone. I called. No answer. Straight to voicemail. I left a message, polite as could be. Hi Karen, it's me. I just wanted to remind you. Your car is still on my property. Please move it when you get the chance. Thanks. No reply. Later that evening, I sent an email. I typed it carefully, rereading every line to make sure my tone stayed calm and civil. Dear Karen, I understand you were visiting Mrs. Pritchett today, but your car was parked on my driveway and partially in my field for nearly an hour. Please, in the future, respect my property and avoid parking here. I clicked send, confident she'd at least acknowledge the message. She didn't. A week passed. Not only did she ignore me, but she did it again. Another weekend, another brunch, another 2 minutes that stretched into an hour. This time, she waved at me as she strolled past my porch, like I was some kind of doorman standing outside her personal venue. I decided to take it to the HOA board. At the next meeting, I stood up, cleared my throat, and explained the situation. Look, I don't want to cause trouble, but Karen has been parking on my property without permission. I've spoken to her. I've emailed her. I've called her. But nothing changes. I'd like the HOA to address this. The room went quiet for a second. Then the chatter started. Well, maybe she didn't realize. It's not really an HOA matter. Maybe you should just put up a sign. Karen, sitting across the table, wore that same tight smile. She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. She just sipped her water and tilted her head slightly, as if amused by my attempt to make a fuss. That was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't about misunderstanding. This wasn't about miscommunication. This was about power. She knew it. I knew it. And the HOA, whether out of fear or favoritism, wasn't going to lift a finger to stop her. It's a strange thing, realizing the polite paths are closed off. You start by asking nicely. You send reminders. You appeal to authority. But when every effort bounces off a wall of arrogance, you're left staring at the truth. Sometimes words don't carry the weight they should. I remember sitting on my porch after that meeting, watching the last light of day fade behind the barn. My goats shuffled in their pen, restless, and the barn swallows darted overhead, chasing insects in the dusk. I thought about my grandfather, who had built this land with his bare hands, and about my father, who had bled to keep it alive. And here I was, letting someone treat it like a casual parking lot. I clenched my jaw. Enough was enough. Of course, once Karen knew she could get away with it. She leaned in harder. It became a pattern. Saturday mornings, brunch meetings, the same lie every time. Oh, just 2 minutes. She'd wave me off with the flick of her wrist, strut across my property, and leave her Bentley standing proud on my soil. Neighbors started to notice too. Why is Karen always parking at your place? One asked. Another whispered. She told us you gave her permission. That was the last straw, not just the trespassing, but the twisting of the truth. I tried one last time. One evening, as she strolled back from her brunch, I intercepted her by the car. Karen, I said, steady but firm. This has to stop. This is my property. I've been more than patient, but I need you to respect my boundaries. She tilted her head, gave that same insincere smile, and said, Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just a car, and it's just a little space. You've got plenty of land." She slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and drove off without another word. That's when I realized she wasn't going to stop. Not with calls, not with emails, not with meetings. To her, my land wasn't land. It was just an empty canvas for her convenience. And unless I acted, it would stay that way. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and played it all back. The tap on the window, the smile, the lies, the laughter over bylaws, the board's indifference, the dismissive wave of her hand. I remember thinking then, crystal clear, this small moment will decide everything. Either I let words keep failing, or I let action speak louder. Her way through the cracks of the system. The system wasn't going to protect me. And in my gut, I already knew what had to be done. I started documenting everything like evidence in a quiet courtroom. If words weren't going to be enough, then proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof, was all I had left. Every time her Bentley rolled onto my driveway, I reached for my phone, snapping photos, with timestamps clear in the corner. I made notes in a little black notebook I kept by the door, scribbling down dates, times, and the length of her trespass. Neighbors started whispering. Some had seen her too, strutting across my property as though it were an extension of her own. A few even came to me privately. "If you need a statement, I'll back you up," one said, shaking his head in disbelief. Another muttered, "She thinks she owns this whole place." I gathered their words like testimony, carefully written down, ready for the day I'd have to present my case. I even started recording conversations, not out of spite, but out of necessity. When I confronted her, gently, calmly, with all the patience I could muster, she always found a way to minimize the disruption. "Oh, it's just a car, don't be so sensitive." Or worse, she'd laugh, toss her hair back, and dismiss me with a sing-song. "Relax, you've got plenty of space." The recordings captured her tone perfectly. Not apologetic, not mistaken, but entitled. After weeks of this, I decided the matter was bigger than just me and her. I gathered my photos, my notes, my recordings, and typed up a formal complaint. I sent professional, polite emails to the HOA board. I wrote them as carefully as a lawyer drafting a contract. No anger, no threats, just facts stacked neatly in black and white. The replies came back in the same sterile tone every time. "Thank you for your submission. The matter will be reviewed. We are currently investigating this issue. Please allow 30 to 60 days for resolution." 30 to 60 days. That's what they said. Meanwhile, Karen was back every weekend, parking in the same patch as if nothing had changed. Each new sight of her car on my soil was like a slap in the face, not just from her, but from the system that claimed to enforce community fairness. The HOA wasn't protecting me. It was protecting her. The more I pushed, the more casual she became. It was almost as if my persistence fed her arrogance. She stopped even pretending it was temporary. Her car lingered longer. Her walks across my field grew bolder. She began treating the space like her personal shortcut, a runway for her stilettos, each step pressing down on land that had never once belonged to her. One evening, I stood by the porch with my arms crossed as she marched across my young field. She wasn't there to talk to me. She wasn't there to apologize. She had simply forgotten an envelope from an earlier meeting and, without a thought, cut across my crops to retrieve it. The shoots were delicate, fragile green blades I had spent weeks coaxing from the soil. Each one was a promise of harvest, of food, of work paying off. And with every step of her sharp heels, those promises snapped, bent, or crushed into the dirt. I called out, "Karen, watch where you're walking." She didn't flinch, didn't slow down. She stooped to grab the envelope, straightened her shoulders, and finally turned to look at me. That smirk, the smirk of a child who's just swiped a cookie before dinner, daring you to do something about it. The smirk of someone who believes consequences are for other people, not for her. It wasn't just arrogance, it was mockery. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the crushed seedlings. I ran my fingers through the dirt, touching the broken stalks as though I could coax them back to life. Farming is about patience, about faith. You plant with no guarantees. trusting the earth to reward your labor. But in that moment, all I felt was anger. It wasn't just about crops. It was about respect. My grandfather had worked these fields with his bare hands. My father had sweated under the same sun, and I had poured my own hours into nurturing this land. And now, some HOA president in high heels thought she could stomp across it like it was nothing more than a decorative rug. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay awake, the images looping in my head. The smirk, the snapped seedlings, the board's hollow replies. I could feel something boiling inside me, a pressure building with no outlet. Word spread faster than I expected. At the feed store, at the diner, even in church, people pulled me aside. She did the same thing to me. One neighbor whispered. She parked in my driveway too. Said it was just for a minute. Good luck getting the HOA to care. They're all afraid of her. The picture became clearer. It wasn't just me she disrespected. It was anyone who dared to stand in the way of her convenience. She had created a pattern of entitlement, and everyone else had simply learned to tolerate it. But I couldn't tolerate it. Not anymore. If she thought she could outlast me, she was wrong. I doubled down. Every incident went into my growing folder. More photos, more recordings, more neighbor statements. If the board wanted evidence, I'd bury them in it. But each time I clicked the shutter, each time I scribbled another note, I felt the futility growing. Evidence only mattered if someone cared to act on it. And the longer this dragged on, the more obvious it became. The HOA wasn't going to act. It didn't matter if I sent them 1 email or 100. It didn't matter if I gave them a mountain of proof. To them, Karen was untouchable. One particular evening pushed me over the edge. I was sitting on my porch when I heard the familiar sound of tires crunching against gravel. I looked up, and there it was again, her Bentley, sliding into the same patch like it had reserved parking rights. This time, though, she didn't even bother with an excuse. She stepped out, phone pressed to her ear, and walked straight across my land without so much as a glance in my direction. She was laughing at something on the call, heels piercing the soil with every step, leaving a trail of destruction behind her. She didn't even see me. I was invisible. My land was invisible. And in that invisibility, I felt something snap. Later that night, as I flipped through the folder of evidence, I realized I had enough to build a case. Enough to argue in front of a judge if I wanted. But deep down, I knew what would happen. Months of hearings, more delays, and the same smirks as she twisted. So, sitting in the quiet hum of my kitchen, I found myself at a crossroads. I could keep collecting proof, stacking paper against paper, and waiting for justice that might never come. Or I could let action speak for me. I leaned back in my chair, the folder of evidence heavy on the table, and stared out the window at the faint silhouette of the Bentley parked where it didn't belong. I remember thinking then, clear as the moon hanging in the sky, this small moment would decide whether words or action would carry the day. I own an old excavator, and to most people, it probably looks like a relic. The paint is faded, the seat is worn, and the controls take a steady hand. But to me, it's not junk. It's a partner. A machine that has saved my back and my wallet more times than I can count. On this land, it's dug drainage ditches when the rains threatened to drown my crops. It's lifted stubborn rocks out of the soil, fixed sagging foundations, and cleared out dead trees after storms. It's not a toy, not some overgrown gadget to show off. It's a tool. And in the right hands, it's heavy, precise, and powerful. I didn't buy it to make a statement or to scare anyone. I bought it to keep my farm alive. Every time I climb into that seat, I'm reminded that this land demands more than muscle. It demands the right equipment. But sitting there one evening, staring at Karen's Bentley parked where it had no business being, I realized something. Sometimes a tool can do more than just move dirt. Sometimes it can make a point. It started as a whisper in the back of my mind. What if the excavator wasn't just for Earth? What if, instead of begging people to take my word seriously, I used a machine to show them consequences in a language they couldn't ignore? At first, I pushed the thought away. It felt reckless, petty even. But the more I turned it over, the clearer it became. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about ruining her car. It was about setting a boundary that couldn't be laughed off, smirked at, or buried in paperwork. When someone won't hear your words, Sometimes the only option left is to let action speak louder. I pulled out an old map of the property one night and laid it across the kitchen table. With a pencil, I traced the edges of my driveway, the field, the soft spots in the soil where water pooled. I marked where her Bentley usually sat, that smug rectangle of entitlement that always seemed to land in the same place. I didn't sketch out destruction. I didn't want that. What I planned was more symbolic. A trench dug just close enough to make a point, just shallow enough to trap a car without crushing it. Something undeniable. Something she couldn't drive away from. Every line I drew was careful, deliberate. Not vandalism, not violence, a consequence. Before I went any further, I talked to a few trusted neighbors. Not the ones who whispered but stayed silent. Not the ones who'd side with Karen because they feared her. The ones who had seen what I'd seen. One evening, sitting on my porch with the cicadas buzzing, I laid it out for them. "I've tried everything," I said. "The photos, the emails, the board. Nothing works. She keeps parking here like it's hers. I'm thinking about using the excavator. Not to destroy anything, but to send a message. To make it clear this ends here." At first, there was silence. Then one neighbor leaned forward. "You know, part of me thinks that's the only thing she'll understand." Another added, "As long as it doesn't wreck the car, just teaches her a lesson, I'll stand by you." We agreed on the principle. The goal wasn't to ruin someone's life. It wasn't even about the car. It was about stopping a point of view, the dangerous idea that rules only apply to some people while others glide above them. Before I could act, I needed to know exactly how it would play out. The excavator is a beast of a machine, and precision matters. I didn't want a wild accident. I wanted control. So I spent evenings in the seat, practicing. I dug shallow lines in a corner of the field, lowering the bucket with the gentlest touch until I could shave the surface of the soil without disturbing the roots beneath. I raised the arm high, then eased it down with the patience of a surgeon. When I felt confident, I set up an old tripod and camera to record. Not because I wanted fame, not because I wanted to humiliate her, but because I knew if this ever went before the HOA, or worse, before a judge, I'd need proof that it was done with care, not malice. The camera angles mattered as much as the bucket's angle. Of course, even as I planned, doubt gnawed at me. Late at night, lying in bed, I'd hear the voice of my grandfather. "Respect the land, respect your tools, respect yourself." Was I breaking that code by turning the excavator into a weapon of sorts? But then another voice would rise. The memory of Karen's smirk, the sound of her heels crushing my seedlings, the board's dismissive emails. Respect, I realized, isn't just something you give. It's something you demand when others refuse. What was worse? Letting her walk all over me, or taking a stand that showed where the line truly was. Days passed, and the Bentley kept showing up. Each time, it gleamed in the sun like a challenge, daring me to act. Each time, I felt the plan solidify. Neighbors started watching too. A few would glance from their porches, then at me, as if to ask silently, "When are you going to do it?" One even whispered as I walked past, "If you're going through with it, let me know. I'll bring my camera too." It wasn't just my fight anymore. It had become symbolic for everyone who'd been ignored, dismissed, or belittled by her. The evening I finally decided, the air felt different. Still, heavy, charged like a storm waiting to break. I walked the field slowly, tracing the lines I'd marked on the map, pacing out distances with careful steps. I ran my hand over the excavator's faded paint, checked the hydraulic lines, tested the controls. The machine roared to life with its familiar growl, steady and powerful. As I eased it forward, I felt the weight of the decision settle into my bones. This wasn't about anger anymore. It wasn't even about Karen. It was about respect for myself, for my land, for the principle that no one, not even an HOA president with a Bentley, gets to treat another person's home like a doormat. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky orange and purple, I sat high in the excavator's cab and looked down at the empty driveway, waiting for her inevitable arrival. The bucket hovered above the soil, steady in my hands. I remember thinking then, with crystal clarity, this small moment will decide whether words or action will carry the day. And I knew, when the Bentley rolled in again, Exactly what I was going to do. I chose dusk. Not because I was trying to be dramatic, but because dusk has its own kind of gravity. The sun dips low, shadows stretch long, and the world feels quieter, like the land itself is holding its breath. Dusk is when secrets settle and decisions harden. That was the hour I knew it had to happen. The farm felt different that night. Usually, at that hour, I'd be feeding goats, rinsing tools, or pouring a cup of coffee for the long hours ahead. But this time, I wasn't tending to chores. I was tending to a decision months in the making. A handful of neighbors stood nearby. Not rowdy, not excited solemn. They carried phones, yes, but not for spectacle. They weren't looking for entertainment. They were there to capture truth, to make sure that if this ever twisted into gossip or a courtroom claim, the story would remain rooted in evidence. Some leaned on fence posts, others kept their distance on porches. Their presence was quiet, almost reverent, like witnesses in a small-town trial. Nobody cracked a joke. Nobody whispered. The weight of the moment pressed down on all of us. No different. Folding chairs were dragged into the community hall, a pot of bitter coffee brewed, and the same tired agenda was scrapped for one item only: incident at the farm. The board sat stiffly, papers in hand, pens clicking nervously. Karen swept in late, as usual, her sunglasses large enough to block half her face, though everyone could see the scowl underneath. I climbed into the excavator, and the familiar smell of grease and earth wrapped around me. My hands found the worn controls, smoothed by years of use. I turned the key, and the engine rumbled awake, deep, steady, and loud enough to make a few birds scatter from the hedges. The sound cut through the stillness like a sermon bell. Every head turned, every eye fixed on me. My pulse kept time with the engine's growl. I eased the machine forward, careful on the gravel, its tracks grinding the earth with deliberate weight. This wasn't a race. This wasn't a fit of rage. This was precision. I guided the excavator to the spot where the Bentley sat, gleaming like it owned the space. The car's polished black finish caught the last of the sunlight, reflecting the scene like a mirror that didn't belong. With a steady hand, I lowered the bucket. Metal met earth with a soft scrape. I worked slowly, like a surgeon making the first incision. The arm dipped, the soil gave, and a neat trench began to form along the passenger side of the car. I wasn't aiming for destruction. I didn't want shattering glass or twisted steel. I wanted clarity, a message that could be seen, photographed, and understood without a single word. From the corner of my eye, I could see the neighbors watching. A few raised their phones, recording. Others just folded their arms tighter. The air was thick, as if everyone was waiting for a thunderclap that never came. Every move of the bucket was deliberate. Dig, lift, drop. The soil shifted with a heavy sigh. The trench deepened just enough to destabilize, just enough to let gravity make its point. I felt like I was chiseling into stone, slow, exact, patient. Sweat dripped down my forehead, even though the evening air was cool. This wasn't about strength. It was about control. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was only minutes, the ground began to change. The soil under the Bentley's passenger side softened, loosened, and gave way. There was a pause, then a groan of shifting weight. The car tilted ever so slightly, lowering itself into the space I'd carved, like a king reluctantly stepping down from a throne. The tires sank just a few inches, enough to warp the angle, enough to make driving out impossible without serious help. The moment was quiet, but it was unmistakable. The Bentley no longer stood proud. It sat trapped, humbled, caught in a reality it couldn't charm or bribe its way out of. By the time I shut off the excavator, midnight had crept in. The world was dark except for porch lights and the glow of phones capturing the aftermath. The machine settled with a final hiss, and the silence that followed was immense. I climbed down from the cab, boots hitting the ground with the heaviness of closure. The neighbors stayed quiet, watching me as though they'd just seen something sacred, or at least something final. The Bentley sat lower now, its nose slightly dipped, its polished body awkward in the soil. It wasn't destroyed. It wasn't ruined. But it was undeniably out of place, undeniably wrong. I stood there for a long while, hands on my hips, staring at the scene. Relief washed over me, but not the wild, victorious kind. This was quieter. A tired relief, like finishing a long day's work you didn't want to start but had no choice to complete. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't smashed. I hadn't broken a single thing. But the message was clear as the trench in the earth. This is my land. You cannot ignore it anymore. My shoulders loosened. The knot in my chest eased. And for the first time in months, I felt like I had spoken a language everyone could understand. One that didn't need permission, translation, or approval. Neighbors lowered their phones. Some nodded to me in quiet solidarity. One man muttered just loud enough for me to hear. About time. No applause, no cheers. Just the sense that something had been corrected, like a fence mended or a crooked post straightened. They walked back to their homes, leaving me alone with the machine and the car, the soil still smelling freshly turned. I walked back to the house slowly, boots heavy with dirt. Behind me, the Bentley sat like a lesson waiting to be read. Ahead of me, my porch light glowed, steady and warm. I remember thinking then, with every step, with every breath, that this small moment had indeed decided something. Not the world, not the neighborhood, not the HOA, but me. It decided that words, when ignored too long, must sometimes be carried by action. Morning hit with gossip faster than fertilizer in spring. On farms, dawn usually means roosters, coffee, and chores. But that morning, it meant whispers traveling across fences and texts buzzing on phones. Before the sun had fully stretched across the horizon, half the town already knew that Karen's prized Bentley had sunk into my soil. And Karen, she went straight to the stage she loved best, social media. By mid-morning, she was live streaming, phone in hand, tears that didn't quite fall glistening in her eyes. She flitted between outrage and theatrical disbelief, her voice rising and breaking like she was auditioning for a soap opera. This is vandalism, she declared. This is a hate crime against homeowners' rights. In one breath, she demanded justice. In the next, she called for retribution. That farmer thinks he's above the law. He thinks he can humiliate me, us, and get away with it. Her followers, mostly HOA loyalists and curious onlookers, chimed in with comments. Angry emojis, fire emojis, calls to press charges. But not everyone was buying it. Mixed into the chaos were sharp questions. Why was your car parked on his land to begin with? Didn't you ignore his complaints? She dodged those questions with the grace of a politician, pivoting to her favorite refrain. This isn't about me. This is about protecting community values. By noon, the HOA had called an emergency meeting. They always prided themselves on efficiency when their interests were at stake. And this half the room wanted to punish me immediately for taking matters into my own hands. Words like reckless, dangerous, and illegal were thrown around with the same energy they usually saved for weeds in sidewalk cracks. But the other half of the room leaned forward, arms crossed, demanding to know why the president of their HOA thought private property was just a suggestion. Then came the reporter, not one of those flashy out-of-town types chasing a scandal, but our local weekly paper's steady hand. A man with a notepad, a sharp pencil, and no patience for drama. He found me where I was most comfortable, leaning against my barn, dirt on my boots, the excavator still parked like a silent witness behind me. He asked plain questions. No spin, no bait. What happened? Why now? So I laid it out. The timeline, the photos with timestamps, the polite emails, the crushed seedlings, the recordings where she laughed off disruption like it was beneath her. I explained how every attempt at civility was dismissed, delayed, or ignored. I told him this wasn't about one car or one night. It was about a pattern, a refusal to respect boundaries, and the failure of those meant to enforce fairness. When I finished, he just nodded, scribbled his notes, and said, "That'll do." When the paper ran the piece 2 days later, everything shifted. The headline was plain. Farmer documents months of HOA neglect before taking action. The photos spoke louder than any words. Karen's Bentley, tilted in my soil, surrounded by neighbors with cameras, the trench sharp and deliberate. But it wasn't the sinking that caught people's attention. It was the evidence, the emails, the recordings, the photos of seedlings trampled under stiletto heels. The story of one polite request after another brushed off until the silence became unbearable. Suddenly, the town wasn't talking about whether I'd gone too far. They were asking how long the HOA had ignored its own members. That's when the floodgates opened. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet began coming forward. Not to cheer what I'd done. Most of them weren't interested in celebrating trenches or tractors, but to share their own stories of being dismissed. The man whose fence was knocked down by a board member's construction truck then told it was an accident not worth documenting. The woman fined for leaving her recycling bin out an extra day, while Karen's weekend-long driveway parties were overlooked. The young couple whose garden was threatened because it didn't fit neighborhood aesthetics, even though it was their only source of fresh produce. One by one, voices rose. The paper printed follow-up pieces. At the next HOA meeting, the board couldn't ignore the pattern. Karen tried to keep up the performance. She held another live stream, this time waving the HOA's bylaws like a shield, shouting phrases like gross misconduct and property destruction. But the comments section had turned. Instead of support, questions poured in. Why didn't you stop parking on his land after the first warning? Why did you laugh at him in emails? Why did you crush seedlings that weren't yours? She tried to spin it, but the more she spoke, the more defensive she sounded. Outrage only works when people believe you're the victim. And now, with evidence on the table, she couldn't play that part anymore. Under pressure from both the town and the HOA's own members, the board announced mediation. Not a trial, not a scandal to drag out, but a formal process to resolve the matter. I sat across from Karen in a plain office, her sunglasses off now, her eyes sharp but tired. The mediator laid out the evidence, step by step, every ignored message, every form letter, every time-stamped photo. Finally, the weight of documentation pressed too heavy even for her. She folded her arms, exhaled sharply, and muttered the closest thing I'd ever hear to an admission. Fine. I'll apologize. Let's just end this. The apology wasn't warm, wasn't heartfelt, but it was public. She stood before the board, the same neighbors she'd once dismissed, and acknowledged that she had overstepped, ignored complaints, and treated private property as if it were her own. The HOA was forced to review its policies. No more brushed-off complaints. No more selective enforcement. Procedures were tightened, transparency improved, and suddenly the very system that had once silenced us was being reshaped. As for Karen, her influence dimmed. She remained in the neighborhood, but her authority had cracks now. The smirk she once wore so easily had faded. People were no longer afraid to question her. And me? I went back to my goats, my fields, and my excavator. Life didn't turn into a fairy tale. Karen didn't become my best friend. The HOA didn't transform into saints. But something important had shifted. Standing by the barn one evening, watching the sun dip low again, I thought back to that trench, that moment when steel met soil and silence turned into clarity. I remember thinking then, and still now, that this small moment truly had decided whether words or action would carry the day. And for once, action had not just spoken louder than words. It had forced the words into being. People watched clips of confrontations and assumed the spectacle was the point. A viral moment, a dramatic twist, the gotcha everyone waits for. But I can tell you straight, that was never what this was about. The excavator wasn't about humiliation. The trench wasn't about revenge. This was about something quieter and heavier. Dignity, fairness, and the slow corrosive power of small abuses when they pile up over time. A single car parked once in the wrong place is no tragedy. A smirk brushed off as harmless mischief might not topple kingdoms. But repeated, unchecked, those little moments eat away at a person. They whisper the same poisonous lie. You don't matter. Your voice doesn't count. Your home isn't yours. That's what made this more than a petty argument about parking. It was about whether a farmer on his own soil could be dismissed endlessly while someone in a position of authority laughed it off. And once you understand that, you see that the excavator wasn't chaos. It was a line in the sand, or rather, a line in the soil. Standing up doesn't have to mean shouting or breaking things. Sometimes it means drawing a line, a clear, undeniable boundary that says, my home, my labor, and my legacy deserve respect. That's what I did that night. The line wasn't in a courtroom or an email inbox. It was dug into the earth itself, in the same soil my grandfather had worked with his bare hands. Boundaries aren't just fences or laws. They're the invisible lines that let us hold our heads up, that tell the world we won't let ourselves be trampled. And once those lines are visible, even the most stubborn abusers are forced to see them. After the dust settled, and after the car was finally removed, I went back to what I know best, repairing. I filled the trench, smoothed the soil, and replanted the seedlings that had been crushed. My hands went back into the dirt, not to punish, but to heal. There's something grounding in that work. Every seed tucked into the soil reminded me this wasn't about destruction. It was about restoration. Where her heels had left scars, I planted rows of green. Where the trench cut the earth, I leveled it until you'd never know it had been there, except in the memory of what it had stood for. The land forgave faster than people do. By the time shoots pushed through again, it was already reclaiming itself. The bigger repair, though, wasn't in the soil. It was in the neighborhood. The HOA had been forced to confront its own negligence. For years, it had wielded policies, like weapons against the powerless, while looking away when its own leaders broke the rules. But after this, things shifted. Rules only matter if they're enforced equitably. After the incident, meetings became less about micromanaging flower beds and more about accountability. Procedures changed. Neighbors who had once felt silence began to speak. And slowly, the culture of fear around Karen cracked. She learned, too, that there are limits to smiling your way out of conflict. That charm doesn't erase evidence. That ignoring small voices eventually builds to a roar. I share this story not to glorify conflict, not to encourage anyone to grab heavy machinery to solve their problems, but to show something different, that boundaries matter, that when words are ignored too long, action sometimes becomes the only language left. But even then, action doesn't have to mean chaos. It can be purposeful, controlled, and aimed not at revenge but at clarity. This wasn't about sinking a car. It was about lifting up a principle, that every person, no matter their status, deserves to have their home respected. Farming teaches you certain truths. You learn that soil can heal, but only if tended. You learn that machines carry power, but only if used with discipline. You learn that every action leaves a mark, whether in dirt or in memory. That night, when the excavator's bucket cut the trench, I wasn't thinking about drama. I was thinking about legacy, about whether I'd let my grandfather's land be mocked and misused, or whether I'd stand in its defense. It was steel meeting soil, but also history meeting arrogance. And the soil won. If you're listening to this story, maybe you faced your own Karen. Maybe not a car parked on your farm, but someone who disrespected your time, your work, your home. Someone who smiled while dismissing you. Someone who thought the rules didn't apply to them. You don't need an excavator to stand up. You just need the resolve to draw your boundary. To say, this matters. I matter. Enough is enough. And when you do, you'll find what I found, clarity. The kind that doesn't need shouting or spectacle. The kind that forces people to finally see what they've been ignoring. When I look back now, I don't replay the rumble of the excavator or the sight of the Bentley tilting into the soil. I think of the seedlings growing again. I think of the neighbors who found their voices. I think of the rules rewritten not in stone, but in practice. That's what endures. Not the spectacle, but the repair. Not the conflict, but the boundary. And in that, there's dignity. I remember thinking then, and I still believe it now, that this small moment would decide whether words or action would carry the day. And the truth is, they both did. The action made space for the words. The trench forced a conversation. The sinking of a car lifted the principle that boundaries matter. That's the lesson I carry. That's the lesson I share. Not to glorify what happened, but to remind us all, our homes, our labor, and our legacies deserve respect. And when they're denied, we have the right, and sometimes the duty, to stand firm. And that's how it all went down. One stubborn piece of land, one entitled Karen, and one excavator that finally made the point. Now, if you enjoyed this story, do me a favor. Hit that like button so more people see it. Drop a comment and let me know. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? I read every single one. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty more real stories and wild confrontations coming your way, and you won't want to miss the next one. All right, thanks for hanging out with me today. Until next time, stay strong, stay fair, and take care of your own patch of land. I'll see you in the next story.